Hello and welcome to our next section on water and cell membranes, and we just finished talking about water, how the structure of water leads to all the different properties of water, and now we're going to apply this knowledge to what we know about cell membranes. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the structure of what your cell membranes look like. So if you were to look inside every single cell in your body, you would see this type of membrane surrounding every single cell in your body. And so it's really important for us to learn about this because this is what controls information going in and out of your cells, what maintains the integrity of your cell shape, all of that wonderful stuff. So let's get into it. Roman numeral 2 is cell membranes. So when we talk about cell membranes, always in biology we got to do structure and function. So let's talk about the structure of what your cell membranes are first. And in the cellular biology world, the structure of a cell membrane is referred to as the fluid mosaic model. So let's write that down and we'll talk about it. So you got a fluid mosaic model. Here's what that means. If you're looking at a cell, here's a cell, and you have your nucleus here and all these other organelles. We're going to talk about all those guys and all this wonderful stuff. When you're looking at just the cell membrane, I'm going to take this portion of the cell membrane and I'm going to blow it up so you can see what it would look like under the microscope. Do you remember what was that lipid we learned about that is one of the major components of the cell membrane? A phospholipid. Do you remember the shape that phospholipid takes in the cell membrane? The two tails are facing together and the heads are on the outside. That's the phospholipid bilayer. So here's what your cell membrane looks like on the inside. I'm just showing you a cross section, but I need to show you the rest of the stuff that's inside as well. Oops, I'm going to I'll color code it for you as well. One more. I promise I will describe all of these things in a second. Okay, that's just one chunk of the cell membrane, and I will do another one out here. Okay, let's define what these components are that make up the fluid mosaic model of a cell. So you already know these guys right here. This is your phospholipid bilayer. And remember how the phospholipid bilayer, well, the phospholipid itself is amphipathic. Remember what that word means? It means you have a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic region within the same molecule. So remember how the heads of the phospholipid are hydrophilic and the tails are hydrophobic, so you make this hydrophobic core that goes throughout the whole membrane. These red boxes that I made, this is how we draw in biology. These guys are proteins. And this protein right here, I'm just cutting it in half right there for you. What that is, that's a special kind of protein. It's called a channel protein. It allows things to go in and out, and different channel proteins allow things to go in and out freely, or you got to be specific for it. There's different types of channel proteins. This one right here is a peripheral protein because it's just hanging on the outside of the cell. There's also other types of proteins that like to hang out on the inside of the cell too. So there's a bajillion different types of proteins that can hang out in the cell membrane. This blue guy, I really sketched it out, but I don't know if you recognize its structure, but this is cholesterol. So cholesterol resides inside the cell membrane as well. And cholesterol does some really neat functions inside the cell membrane. Before I get into that, let's dissect what the fluid mosaic model actually means. So it's fluid because this phospholipid bilayer is honestly moving all the time. If you were to look at the surface of a cell, it would look like you had olive oil floating around in a pot of water. It's just constantly moving. What's really, really neat about these phospholipid heads is that they are moving at, let me pick a couple here to play with. These guys, they're constantly flipping around at 10 to the 7th times a second. That's fast. So 10 to the 7th times. That's 10 billion times a second they are moving around. 10 million, forgive me, not billion. 10 billion times a second they are moving around. However, they don't like to flip-flop. It takes a lot of energy for them to flip-flop because these heads can't really make their way through that hydrophobic core that's going on here. So the flip-flopping of these guys happens about once a month, one time a month, which doesn't happen very often, but it still can happen. So that's the fluid part of the fluid mosaic model. The phospholipid bilayer gives it that fluidity, which is wonderful. The mosaic part, if you've ever made a mosaic or seen a mosaic in art, what mosaics are, I've tried to make one in the past, is you could get different pieces of glass or ceramic and you just put them all together, then you put the grout in between and you get this beautiful mosaic. There's many ways to make mosaics, that's one I've tried. And those mosaic pieces don't move. So the proteins and the cholesterol are part of the mosaic. They stay still inside the membrane, whereas everything else is moving around and that phospholipid bilayer is moving around them. So if you pretend I am a protein in a cell membrane and I'm surrounded by a kindergarten class, those kindergarten kids are going to be running all around me, but I'm going to stay still. So I'm the protein or the cholesterol. That would be the mosaic part of the fluid mosaic model. All right, so now you know what the cell membrane looks like. Let's talk a little bit about what each portion does. So I'm just going to erase the cell and keep this part up. So number one, under structure, it's made of 3 different parts. We're just going to reiterate that right here. So the first part is the phospholipid bilayer. And this is the fluid part. If it wasn't for that unsaturated fatty acid chain in one of the tails for the phospholipid, you wouldn't have that fluidity going on. That's why it's super important at least one of the tails has a kink, or else they'd be able to stack. The second portion, and I'll try to color code this for you here, is the proteins. So the proteins inside the cell membrane, these guys allow for transport and structure. They do a whole bunch of other jobs too. They have cell recognition as well. On every single cell in your body, you have a group of proteins that are on the outside, that are facing the outside of the cell membrane, that basically say, this is me. So if you ever get an organ transplant or anything like that, this is why they try to match people really, really well, because our proteins are somewhat related, but some are related more than others. So if you can get a match that's closest to you, your body won't see it as something foreign as much, and so you'll be more protected. So you have all these self-identifying proteins that don't have anything to do with transport or structure. That's just more of identification in a way. So this is just a very shallow definition of what these proteins can do in the cell membrane. There's a whole lot more, and as you go deeper and deeper into biology, you'll discover more and more, which is wonderful. And lastly, you got cholesterol. And why in the world is cholesterol there? So cholesterol actually helps prevent, it prevents, actually it does 2 things. When temperatures get hot inside, in a cell, in an organism, when temperatures start to rise, you can imagine that the phospholipids will start to move around more, because that's what heat does to organisms. It makes more kinetic energy going on. And what cholesterol does, it actually says, whoa, slow down, you don't need to be moving so fast. It's essentially a speed bump in the road for all of those phospholipids. I want you to pretend, I've given this example before, I used to teach at a K through 12 school. When you release the elementary school kids, when the bell rings and those elementary school kids are out the door, we don't just, open up every single door so these kids can go out and go crazy. We only let them out a few exits because we kind of need an orderly exit out of the building so there's not mass chaos. And that's what kind of cholesterol does. It says, hey, you need to slow down and walk slowly around me. That's what it does. So this helps prevent too much fluidity when it gets warm, and it does another thing too. When it gets too cold, everything starts to slow down. And these lipid molecules like to kind of conglomerate together, and they don't stack necessarily, but they do get tight. And what cholesterol does, if I'm a cholesterol here and I'm another cholesterol here, and there's nothing but lipids between us, phospholipids between us, those phospholipids can kind of get close together, but we're going to make sure that not every single phospholipid gets close together. We're going to be right there preventing stacking of everybody together. So pretend that they're pillars that are set inside the cell membrane that prevent too much fluidity when it's hot and stacking when it's cold. So these are good for temperature regulation, which is great depending on the organism you are. If for us humans, depending where you live, I'm assuming, you might be safe and sound indoors when the weather is really, really bad. But if you're a plant or a forest animal or a desert animal, you don't have that option. You need to be able to keep your cells healthy when the weather goes crazy, and cholesterol helps that out. So cholesterol prevents too much fluidity in heat. Too much fluidity in heat and stacking in cold. Okay. So that is what the phospholipid bilayer structure is like. You got your phospholipids, you got your proteins, you got your cholesterol, you got the fluid mosaic model. So we're going to stop right here because that's about the structure part. Let's get to the function part in our next lesson. The main function of I'll just give you a preview, the main function of your cell membrane is all about providing selective permeability. Just because you're a cell, you're not going to let anybody into your cell or let anybody out of your cell. You need to make sure that the communication is exactly what you need to survive and do your job as a cell. So every cell has its own job, and who they let in and out determines what's going on. So come back, we're going to talk about the different functions of the cell. Get ready for selective permeability.